Tony Blair's aide names FIVE UK failures Brexit negotiations, before Boris caved in. Boris Johnson has been savagely attacked by Tony Blair's former Chief of Staff, who has torn apart the UK's negotiating performance with the European Union in the 4.5 years since the Brexit referendum. Jonathan Powell, who was also chief UK negotiator in Northern Ireland from 1997 to 2007, raged he had never seen a British government perform worse than they did in the 4 years of negotiations that concluded with the Christmas Eve Brexit agreement. He said in terms of the negotiating strategy employed by the UK, it is an object lesson in how not to do it, adding it is worth standing back and looking at what we can learn from the debacle. Mr. Powell then outlined 5 principal reasons as to why the UK has failed in Brexit negotiations with the EU. He wrote for Politico, "We massively overestimated the strength of our negotiating position. It is true we are equally sovereign as the EU, but we are not sovereign equals. They are much larger, and we depend on them much more for trade than they do on us. That is why we have had to back down every step of the way, accepting EU insistence that we agree the divorce agreement first, putting a trade border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, accepting a single legal treaty and finally Boris Johnson caving in just before the end-of-year deadline. The same disparity of strength exists with the US, and we should bear that in mind during trade negotiations with Washington." Mr. Powell said Britain had triggered Article 50 before we were ready, meaning we constantly found ourselves facing a self-inflicted deadline by which we had to concede or face severe economic and political costs. The former Downing Street Chief of Staff said, "Second, we fired the starting gun before we had worked out our own position, with the result that we spent the first 2 years negotiating with ourselves while EU Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier's clock was ticking." Triggering Article 50, the legal mechanism that kicked off a time-limited exit process, before we were ready meant we constantly found ourselves facing a self-inflicted deadline by which we had to concede or face severe economic and political costs. We should have waited until we knew what we wanted and only then pulled the trigger rather than blundering in without knowing our desired endpoint. This was not the fault of the negotiators but of the political leaders.